Well, welcome everyone to the We Are In It Together podcast. I'm Jamie Lynn, and I am very delighted to be here today with Dajana Yoakley. Hi, Dajana.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, my honor. So Dajana has her own podcast, which I highly recommend, the Delighted Parenting Podcast. She is a certified parenting coach and a certified playful parenting leader. Also has a master's in healthcare administration, but in the context of here, probably not the most important credential. An important credential, though, is she is also the mom of 3 boys, right? So in the weeds. And what we're going to focus on today is how do we find delight in parenting? Delight in parenting. So, Diana, if you don't mind, I usually like to start by asking my guests, like, how did you get here in this role? How did you decide to start a Delight in Parenting podcast and kind of brand yourself? Just tell us a little bit about the story about what brought you here.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. So my previous career was working in the healthcare system in a leadership position, and I loved it. It was a great experience. And then I started to have kids, babies, toddlers, and I started to live the parenting life and coming up against parenting struggles. And, I don't think anything really prepares you for parenting, right? Even if you read all these books in advance, which I didn't really. I read some Dr. Sears books about taking care of the baby and what to expect when you're expecting all that. But I didn't understand child development, child psychology, our own emotions as parents, all of these kind of therapeutic approaches to supporting humans living life. That wasn't in my master's degree. I learned about leadership and systems and stuff and processes. So it opened up a whole new world to learn about. And I started to delve into the science behind what is the best parenting approach. And I came across the work of Dr. Laura Markham. She's the founder of Peaceful Parent, Happy Kids. And I had followed her work then starting when my oldest was about 3, 2.5, 3 maybe, and he's almost 13 now. So about a decade. Eventually, I ended up doing a coach training program with Dr. Laura and transitioning from working full-time in the healthcare system to doing more remote work. And just this idea of whose life is this anyway? Life is short. And what do I want to really spend my time doing with my work? What value do I bring to myself and my family and the world and income? And so I decided to venture into this field of parent coaching because most importantly, I needed the coaching myself. I think most of us that become experts at something, really the reason we're doing that work, the passion and the motivation comes from this reward system that we get. We're doing it because we actually need it probably the most. And as you know, the teacher learns the most in the classroom of students, right? And is the biggest ongoing learner. And even with authors, it's they write the books that they need to read, right? Speakers speak the words that they need to hear. And so I'm here to support parents who maybe are in a similar trajectory that I was, not having the knowledge, the science, the psychology understanding of how to parent a child for emotional well-being, for resiliency, for optimal mental health. So I became a parenting coach, certified parenting coach. And then I also wanted to expand my expertise in play because children's language is play, as you very well know, with the stuffies and characters and how they process emotions is through play. And so I wanted to learn more about that. And so I got certified as a playful parenting leader. And along the way of learning about becoming a peaceful parent and how to stop yelling and how to stop being so reactive, I found the work of Dr. Krista Neff, which has been transformative for my own ability to regulate my emotions. So in peaceful parenting, there's these 3 big ideas: self-regulation, connection, and coaching your child versus controlling them. So self-compassion is critical for that first step. You can't do the second 2 if you don't have the self-regulation. And self-compassion basically is the answer that I found in the work of Dr. Krista Neff for developing my own ability to self-regulate more often than not, because nobody's perfect. So that's kind of how I came to this work. I don't know if you have any specific questions on that.
And thanks for sharing that. And by the way, I have somewhere on my desk here, I have that book I have a couple of books by Dr. Markham. So I'm at some point I want to ask Laura Markham to come here. So you have great people that you've learned from. But I guess what I'm curious about. So I want to move into delight, but oftentimes we start with struggle, right? So,
Right.
and all the parents who watch this podcast know that we don't paint over, like, I'm sure delight in parenting is not painting over struggle. So what is kind of is there a struggle that brought you to the solution that brought delight, or like
Yeah.
how do we move through? And if you want to share any of your own struggles, obviously whatever you feel comfortable sharing, but I think that's oftentimes what we relate to.
Right.
And then your story of how does that struggle and that delight like intermingle or like transform? Like, what's that relationship like?
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah.
And
So
also, and maybe I should precede this too, but at some point I want to hear, how do you define delight? But let's start with the
yeah.
struggle, because that's,
Yeah.
I think, oftentimes where we resonate.
Yeah, that sounds great. So you're right. When I work with parents, and when I started to look more into this work and how to become a parent, it was out of struggle. It was out of feeling hopeless and powerless, and feeling lost, and feeling like this isn't how I thought I would parent. This isn't what I thought it would be like. And the delight in parenting kind of goes back to this idea of when you first become a parent, whether it's through the birth of your child, or whether it's through adoption, or like, intermarriage, like whatever it is, if you're choosing to bring a child into your life, it's because you want to add joy to your life, right? Like the reason we have children, I think for the most part, is we want, it's like we expect to see more joy from this experience, right? Like we think parenting is going to be a joy, and this child is going to be a joy, and a child is a gift. It's a miracle, right? And so but then the reality hits, like then when the child comes into our life, whether it's a baby or an older child, and all of a sudden it's like that joy, it's like somebody put holes in the boat and it just drained out, and all that's left is like the to-do list and the schedule and bedtime, feeding, dishes, our own dysregulation, the kids' challenging behavior, everybody's emotions. And then after a little while of a few years of doing that, you start to wonder, like, where did the delight go? And the reason I picked delight in parenting is, to me, it's kind of like the North Star. Like this was the original motivation for many of us. And the idea is that it doesn't have to be joyful all the time, and it won't. But how can we, just like mindfulness isn't about being without thought for like forever, right? It's about remembering. So with the delight in parenting, it's like bringing the delight back into parenting, bringing the joy back into your life. And inevitably, you're going to have moments where life throws you a curveball, and now you're in the weeds, and you're suffering, and it doesn't feel great, and it's really hard. And self-compassion comes in to kind of get you through those slumps, right? Like the hard moments. But inevitably, it's kind of like a wave. It's going to be ups and downs on a pretty balanced life, right? Like some of them are a little bit more jagged than others, but we're trying to get into kind of like this regular rhythm of there's joyful times and there's hard times. And for the hard times, there's self-compassion and these other resources we build for resiliency. And then there's times when things are joyful. And how can we actively and proactively like build more delight into the parenting, into our life? And really, delight in parenting is kind of the broad idea, but it starts with delighting in ourselves. That's also where, yeah, we have to start, like, if the concept that you can only give your children what's inside is true, which I think most of us know it is, right? It's what's inside through mirror neurons. We know that through science, through nervous system regulation, neuroception. We understand that there's a science behind it, but also just kind of spiritually and I think emotionally, we know that, like, if my cup is empty, I don't have much to give. So how can you give delight if you don't have it? How can you give anything if it's not inside of you authentically, right? So we start with delighting in ourselves, which I think is really the secret of parenting. We think it's about these kids, right? They're in our lives for 18 years and then they move on. And yes, they're still in our lives. It's these interrelationships, but then they begin to live, they become the center of their lives and we become kind of on the peripheral. But really the gift of parenting, if we take it for ourselves, is that our kids are our motivation to learn to delight in our own selves. They're like the only people that we are motivated by to move through the trenches and the suffering and the hardships and the resiliency to, like, sometimes crawl our way out of the hole because of the motivation to give our kid the best life we can. But in the process, again, the secret is that we actually can have an opportunity. It's an opportunity to learn to delight in ourselves, because if we want our kids to be, happy, resilient kids, we have to give them in order to give them that, we have to have it inside. So it's like step number one. We want to give them step two, but we can't without step one. So it's almost like through this exchange, if we're up for the challenge and the hard work, we actually are exercising this muscle of delighting in ourselves. And ultimately, when they leave and they become their own adults and have their own families, we actually will live a happier life, a more delightful life, even without them in our home anymore, because we have exercised this delight in them and in parenting them, that now we can actually reap the rewards for ourselves as well.
Yeah. Well, and there's so much depth there in this interrelationship. I'm like, as you're speaking, I'm like, my brain is like listening, and my brain is also like trying to kind of trace my own pathway. And like, when did I have more delight in parenting? When did I have less delight in parenting? And I think I definitely think self-compassion was a big part of it. Because I remember when my daughter was 4 years old, and I had mindfulness already, and I was trying to help her through mindfulness, and let me just say it was ineffective. Right. And I think when we feel ineffective as a parent, there's not a lot of delight there. Right. Like that's like a bowl for self-criticism. It's just like inadequacy, judging what's wrong with me, what's wrong with my child. Like, so in some ways, almost the opposite of delight is like, I'm like this thought that I'm doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. Right. Like, so this is like a source of suffering. And it's kind of interesting, because I really do think in my own case, like, finding self-compassion helped me to, I don't know, I think in some ways stop judging myself, right? Mm-hmm. So that I could, but also around that same, I'm trying to, like, in my own mind, I'm trying to like go back and be like, when did I find Daniel Siegel's book, The Whole Brain Child? And like, was that before I found self-compassion? Because also that paradigm of really trying to parent so that my child's brain will get wired in well, versus what does their behavior look like in this moment per se, right? So like letting go of outcomes to some degree. And it's like, it's hard for me to remember. I think the self-compassion came first, but I feel like if I had just had self-compassion and I hadn't had a resource that helped me to frame parenting as a pathway to helping my child be their most radiant, connected self. And what can I do to do that, rather than how am I shaping their behaviors and of course we want our kids' behaviors to be a certain way, but I don't know. I guess so. I don't know. There's not a fully formed thought, but just some pieces that I think paved the way for me having more delight in parenting. And the absence of those two pieces really made delight in parenting like less accessible.
Right. Yeah. No, I think, and I love this idea. What it makes me think of is like, we want our kids to change when they're having a hard time and having like unskillful behavior. We want them to change. We want to change them as people. And, anyone listening, it's like, when was the last time that you were really effective at changing someone else? Like, how effective has that been? And how good are you at that? Because from my own personal experience, and just based on the science, is that we ultimately can't control another person's behavior, emotions, we can't change them. The only person that can change them is themselves. We can influence them. And one of the best ways to help our child move from unskillful behavior to more skillful behavior is to accept them just as they are. In the messy middle, and the aggression, and the I hate you, or whatever it is, the sibling rivalry, our own reactivity, their reactivity, accepting it as it is. That's like and prior to that, it's like the awareness, right? The awareness to know, to accept. And then step two would be like acceptance. When we accept our kids just as they are, imperfect, and ourselves, suffering and all, that is like the fertilizer for change. That is actually like the psychology of how change has a potential to happen. You still can't control it and force it, but you can create conditions for it to grow. And so and that's kind of like at the core of unconditional love, which I think is also something that I really like try to incorporate in delight in parenting. Like, what does unconditional love mean? If this is like the ultimate love, what does that look like in a practical way? In a very practical way, it's accepting people just as they are. I love you just the way you are. You're good enough just the way you are. I know this is really hard. I know you hate your sibling, and I love you just the way you are. And I know I just lost it, and that is not the way that I wanted to parent, but I'm still a good person. So separating our behaviors from our identity, which I know you probably talk about this all the time, right? So like separating our kids' unskillful behavior from their inherent worth, which is the unconditional love. So when we don't have to accept aggression or like like rude tones or whatever. We can coach them through that and build skills around that. But in order to even get to that part, we want to see the goodness in the person in front of us. And that's what I find really delightful about parenting challenging kids and parents that struggle with their children, is to give them almost like these new goggles and it starts with self-compassion, like we said, like the self-regulation for the parent, because often they feel like they're intertwined with that. What did I do to make it so hard for my kid? What did I not do? Like we're so like, because as Dan Siegel talks about, the me and you and we, like we're all, the mind is like more than just the brain. Like we're intertwined, we're interconnected beyond what we even can understand today, right? Which also makes parenting kind of a spiritual experience, I think, the connectedness like of everything. So we are intertwined with our kids, but at the same time, if we can accept our kids and ourselves in the messiness of it, this is the foundation of like shifting. And when people feel like they are, they're still good enough, that gives them like the resilience, a little bit of resiliency to begin to take responsibility for their unskillful behavior, to take responsibility for hitting their sibling. People can only do better when they feel better. When they feel bad, they will continue to do bad, right? Like, so behavior is really just like an external clue to what's going on kind of underneath the iceberg. Whenever I think of children's like difficult, challenging behavior and our own difficult, challenging behavior, unless it's like my own personal trigger because I'm only human, but with everyone else that I work with, I never think of like this person is bad because they did this behavior. A parent is bad because they lost it or they didn't do this type of thing, that type of parenting. There's always, every behavior makes sense. If anyone that had grown up in your, childhood, had your environment, had your genetic predisposition, and then the epigenetics of the environment, they would have done the same exact thing as you if it was an identical replica of you. And you did the best you can given the resources you had. And we know that like your desire to connect and be in connection with other humans is like a biological imperative. It's a prerequisite for survival. So your natural state is connection and doing well and being good to people. And when you're not good to people, whether you're the parent or you're the child or anyone else in the world, it's an external behavior which is a clue to some unmet need or some lack of support. There's more to the story than just the behavior itself, because humans are wired for social connection. That is the state that we're meant to be. That's what propagates our species. If we just go off and kill each other, that will end our species, and that's just not the way we're wired. Every species is wired for procreation, and for us to procreate, we have to be in a social setting. So that is always kind of what our system is striving for. But when it knocks us out of social connection and we have unskillful behavior, it's because there's something systematically going on that's not supportive. And we always want to ask the question of, what do I need right now to support myself, which perfectly aligns with self-compassion, which is why I love self-compassion.
Yes. And there's so much that you just shared there, including just that beginning piece of acceptance and the importance of acceptance. And again, when I sift back through my own, again, oftentimes it's like, it's the juxtaposition, right? Like, when did I have more delight? When did I have less delight? Like, I remember I had struggles with delight at different points in my kids' growth and development. Like, my younger one had some behaviors that were like non-optimal, and like you said, like, not to judge them. But I remember there was a period of time where it was also affecting her social relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I needed her to I guess I thought like sometimes it's a loving parent to say, look, this behavior, this way of viewing this world
Yeah.
is causing problems in your relationships with others. And yet I kept triggering shame in her
Uh-huh.
whenever I would try. And it was like, I remember that was a real hard time. And then somehow she grew where she was able to like integrate that awareness with love. Like she felt
Yeah.
loved by me, but she also knew. And then our relationship shifted in such a positive way because now I don't know, because I feel like there was a point where I was trying to so unconditionally accept love and nurture that I'm like, but doggone it, this girl needs some serious feedback.
Uh-huh. Right.
So
Right.
I
Right.
do think it's this balance as parents sometimes. And again, there's been certain points in my kids' childhoods where I thought, I really want to be connected, but I have to give some feedback. And I
Right.
know they're not going to love it, but
Right.
they need this in order to be their best selves. And anyways, but it's really an interesting thing for how do we do this and how do
Yeah.
we balance
Yeah.
helping them feel our unconditional love and acceptance while we gently, lovingly, and
Yeah.
also clearly let them know that this particular way of
Mm-hmm.
viewing or this particular behavior is an obstacle to them
Right.
being their best selves.
Yeah.
That's that, by the way. Whew. That I feel like I look back at that and I still don't even know how I did it. And I'm so grateful that like we got
Yeah.
through it. But I wasn't experiencing huge amounts of delight, I think, during that period because again, I think whenever I'm lacking delight, it's because I feel like I can't do it right.
Right.
Right? Because I think during that
Mm-hmm.
period, I felt like if I gave her feedback, I was impairing our connection. But if
Yeah.
I just only validated and listened and held space, I was not giving her what she needed either. And
Right.
I hate those no-win scenarios. And I think again, that's where sometimes self-compassion comes in.
Right.
Sometimes we are at those points and it doesn't mean we're doing anything wrong. It just means this is a messy, difficult place to be in. And how can we love ourselves and love our child while we collectively move through this messy, difficult place?
Yeah, no, I love that. And no, it's a perfect example. And I want to go back to the framework of peaceful parenting because it actually addresses how we balance these two, the empathy and the validation and the unconditional love with feedback and setting limits and building skills and reflection. And so again, the three big ideas are self-regulation, which is the parent showing up with resources to stay regulated, not necessarily calm and joyful and happy, but regulated enough to keep their prefrontal cortex online. And then the next step is connection, which is starts off with like you're saying, the empathy and validation, like this is so hard, like I'm so sorry I wasn't there to help when you guys got into a thing or whatever, like physical touch, like soothing physical touch. So physical connection, emotional connection, empathy, validation. And then the third step of the three big ideas is coaching versus controlling. So controlling would be next time you do this, this is what's going to happen. It's like maybe a threat or a consequence where we're trying to control the child's behavior, but we just talked about how you can't really control anyone. You can only create the conditions in which they can succeed, like a plant. You can't control the plant to grow a flower and then a bud and then a vegetable, but you can check on the soil, make sure there's enough sunlight. When was the last time you watered that plant? Like is the dog coming over there and chewing off the leaves, right? Like how are you keeping this plant safe so that it has a genetic predisposition to grow and to learn? And kids are they're like you said, at some point she like outgrew it. Well, one of the things we don't give enough credit to is nature and brain development. I mean, literally, if you were to do like a functional MRI scan of a baby to like an 18-year-old, you would see how much the brain grows. And oftentimes it's like if we can only keep those like house plant to-do lists in mind, the plant will naturally succeed if we can, and again, nobody's perfect, right? Like sometimes we forget to water the plant. It's like, oh, catch up. Or like, it's winter, so now I have to find more sunlight because it's not so, maybe like it's a dark room or whatever. So we adjust for that, but so much of it is like nature will do a lot of it for us if we kind of like step back a little bit and just try not to damage it so much, right? Like with our own interventions of trying to control the plant. It already knows what the blueprint is for growth. Your child's brain knows what it needs to grow into from a brain perspective if conditions are right. So in terms of how we support them though throughout some of these tough situations, right? Like hitting or like responding in a rude way to your friend like that isn't going to keep you that friend, right? Like they're going to stop being friends with you or whatever. So how do we deliver that? So that's this idea of coaching where, so the first thing is like, again, like if they're having a hard time, we go in with empathy and validation and we accept everything just as it is, because that settles down their nervous system. It brings them out of the fight, flight, freeze back into their own prefrontal cortex. Even a toddler that's just beginning to grow prefrontal cortex, it soothes. We're looking for safety. That connection creates nervous system safety, which is the only state that you can actually learn in. If they're like, hyperventilating or mad, they're not going to learn what you're about to say. And then the coaching steps comes in after that. And sometimes we have to set a limit. It's not okay to hit. Next time that you need something, what can you do differently, But oftentimes with these behaviors, often, not always, often it's not an information gap. So let's say like your child was struggling with aggression or like talking rudely. Do you really think that like a 5-year-old doesn't know it's not okay to hit? Like, do they know it's okay to hit or not? Most of them know. Pretty much all kids know, right? Like, do they know that it's not okay to call somebody a loser or stupid head, right? Like they know that it's not okay, but they're still doing it. So that's again like the iceberg idea. Their imperative is to connect, but when they're not able to, something is blocking their ability to access that skill. And it's usually because they're not in their prefrontal cortex. So oftentimes with this coaching idea and like building skills, it's not even like we're having to add more. Like I need to teach them that it's not okay to hit people. I need to teach them that it's not okay to be rude. If we remove the problem, the barriers that they're encountering, and we work on problem solving those and finding win-win solutions and kind of removing like, why did they hit? Well, because their sibling, it feels like their sibling always gets everything first, like there's some sibling jealousy. And it's like, and yes, they have like some impulse control challenges maybe right now, but again, nature will it'll smooth that out over time. It won't be like this forever, right? As long as we're kind of on track, we stay on track on average, right? Not perfectly. So removing some of these like unmet needs, like, or adding unmet needs or removing barriers, like a thorn in her side, like it makes her want to like hit somebody that comes near her because it's like, ouch, this hurts. So what the parent can do, instead of saying like lecture about don't hit, or like next time you hit, this is what the consequence will be because you need to learn. Often it's not even about learning and information. So they don't need a lecture. What they need is for us to take the thorn out, to show them that we love them unconditionally and kind of melt that chip on the shoulder with sibling rivalry, or to ask them maybe reflective questions. How did that work out for you when I know you and your friend got into that like argument and I heard you guys using some tones with each other. How did that work out? Not so great. Often it's helpful to ask more reflective questions than to give information, because again, it's like deep down, they know authentically what they wanted, which was connection, but somehow like, the system failed them. Like life got in the way, like a feeling bubbled up that made it really hard to like be kind. Jealousy bubbled up and it made me like want to take that from them, from their hand, because I want one too. I really want one. Like, how come I don't have one and they do? And I can't help myself because impulse control, because prefrontal cortex development. So they just took it. So addressing the underlying unmet needs or the needs driving the behavior is kind of where we want to focus our energy when we think about coaching and building skills. So then ultimately, when you really reframe like 9 out of 10 misbehavior, probably even 100, but let's say 9 out of 10 misbehaviors, if you were to actually put yourself into your child's shoes, it would like, and you truly understood the experience that they were going through, it would make you like want to cry. Because the reason that people act, when people hurt someone, it's because they're hurting. When they are withholding, it's because they feel like they don't have enough. There's no such thing as true misbehavior. It's missed behavior. Something that was prior to that we missed. And this resulted, they're always trying to get their needs met in the best way that they know how. So any misbehavior in our eyes it's just really their best attempt at getting their own needs met.
Yeah,
and that feels really delightful once you can get to like, I mean, and you can't always access it because, we're not always in our prefrontal cortex, but when we can kind of get to the bottom of these, challenging triggers and family dynamics that are challenging, and truly work with like a coach or like finesse these skills of getting underneath the unmet behavior and seeing our kid for the good kid that they are, and ask, like Dr. Becky says, why would a good kid do that? That feels so delightful because there's so much hope. You talked earlier about feeling powerless and not like, well, yeah, it is hard because there's a lot of like information we just talked about, and there's a lot of skill building for the parent and scaffolding and community support. But when you can get kind of into this rhythm of like getting underneath this misbehavior and challenging family dynamics and even your own reactivity, there's so much like, it's like the budding plant out of concrete. It's like delight. Because look, hope. What's more powerful than fear and control? Even in a mass of people, but even in yourself, it's the hope that something else can emerge. So that feels really delightful to me. And that just, it's just so much transformation possible for parents, for family dynamics, children's misbehavior.
Yeah. And I appreciate you highlighting again this idea that one, the parent needs to view the child as a good person, you know, either lacking in skills or using poor strategies. And then I think what can happen when the parent really sees this clearly, and I think, again, thinking back to that same scenario that I was talking about when my daughter was struggling, and again, it was a friendship dynamic thing years back, and she couldn't admit it to herself, I think because she was judging herself.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think, again, pieces of what helped us move through was me being like, you are a good person. Yeah. And this behavior is a mismatch for what you want. And then helping her to understand, like you're saying. So like the adult needs to understand, what are they wishing for? Right. What is like the unmet need beneath their perhaps unskillful behavior, and how can we help their kid actually have that same understanding that this is what you're really wishing for. This isn't working. You're a good person. I love you. And sometimes it's funny because I've heard this paradigm of being, of moving from incompetence to competence, and how in the beginning, oftentimes we are unconsciously incompetent. Yeah, like we're just not good and we have no idea. Then we become consciously incompetent. And this is an awful place to be when you realize, oh, I'm not being skillful, but you don't have the skills yet to be more skillful.
And that might be what's happening to like your audience listening right now. Like, oh, it makes sense what they're saying. I understand that intellectually, but when they go out later and it's like they try to do this coaching thing with their kid or self-compassion, it's like, why can't I do that? Like, something's wrong with me. I bet all these other people are doing it correctly, but even though I know, I can't do it yet.
Yeah, and when we're in that conscious incompetence, if you will, that's when we need self-compassion the most, because it's hard to stay there. There's this temptation to try to like be in a different place than we are, which is just kind of unhelpful, or to kind of go back to like, who cares, that wasn't a good goal anyways, right? Like go back to the unconscious, because it's it's like if we can hold ourselves and hold our kids in that space where this isn't skillful, you are a good person and I love you, like that really is compassion, self-compassion. Then we can become eventually, and again, it takes kids longer because like you're saying, like the developing prefrontal cortex, they can become consciously competent and then eventually unconsciously competent.
Right.
Ooh, right. And then
when it's a habit.
Yeah, it's a habit. And then again, parenting becomes so much more delightful, because like, it's funny because I was talking to someone the other day about their teens and they were saying how parenting teens is hard. I've got a 12 and a 16-year-old. And I'm like, for me, first off, I like older kids better than younger kids. So like parents have their preferences and that's okay, right? Like, you don't have to delight equally in every age, right? Like, and second off, like when my daughter says, my younger daughter will sometimes say, I hate you, mommy. And I'll say, honey, you're thinking that you hate me. And she's like, I'm thinking that I hate you. Like we try to be mindful. And it's funny. We both laugh about it, right? We laugh about it because I'm trying to teach her to be mindful. But like, I never take this personally, ever. Because I know she loves me. I know she's just having a moment. She's 12. And so it doesn't detract from our relationship. So we can go back to delight so much easier. And I know this is not a behavior that's going to like stick.
Right.
But it's like, I don't know. I feel like it's easier in some ways right now with their teens, but I think it's also because we've developed this relationship where we know what's underneath the surface. We know
Right.
that behaviors are a symptom of feeling yucky.
Right.
And we come back to love, and that allows us to come back to a space of connection.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think understanding like the neurobiology and the science of child development and kind of these psychological like concepts that all of us as humans, including kids, can get trapped in, where it's like, I hate you. What does that really mean? You know, probably the child is saying something that they don't like something about themselves. You know, but if you don't know that, you would think they literally mean that they hate you. But most likely, why would somebody say that they hate someone else? Because something feels uncomfortable in them, you know? Why would somebody hurt somebody else's body? Because they're experiencing pain. So if you can reframe that, all of a sudden you feel almost pity for her, right? And almost like sad. Like, and that's where empathy comes in. That's how you can have empathy for somebody that says, I hate you, because it's like, what must be going on in her life and her body and her brain for her to say something that also hurts her? Why would she cut off her own arm? You know, like when it hurts her too. The most important person in her life is her parents, her direct caregivers, usually, right? So the attachment, she wants to preserve, she needs it for survival. Why would she cut off the attachment? Something feels threatening. And it's like, it's a call for us to like go and help. Again, it has nothing to do with us, right? Because their natural state is to want to be connected to us. Yeah, I love that. And I just want to clarify this idea of delight. I know externally it sounds like joy, like choose joy and just like, you know, delight 24/7. What I really mean with delight in parenting is welcoming all emotions. And it's almost like the diversity of our experiences is what makes life rich. That's where the delight really comes from. There's hard times and there's good times. But what I love about self-compassion is like, even during the darkest of times, you can feel a little better. That's delightful. Like when you're really suffering and you can authentically experience that true self-compassion we're talking about, it's like, wow, like so cool. Like that there's this mammalian, like, you know, caregiving system inside of us that actually alleviates some of our pain on a neurobiological level. That is just like amazing, you know? Like, I don't know. I just think it's like so cool. Like, and when we can get to this point where all emotions are welcome. And again, it's like, it's not a perfect system. Sometimes it's going to trigger you when you're a kid. Probably a lot of times it'll trigger you when they're showing you these uncomfortable emotions. And you're like, you don't want to be like that. Come on, let's just be happy. But again, as we mature and we evolve and we become more wise than intelligent, right? Like into our own like older years, my hope is that, you know, we as parents become like wiser. And, you know, like the quote about like famous, like people like saying like, at the end of life, it's like, I realized I didn't know much at all. It's like, we feel like, but I know so much. And like, now I have it all figured out. But really the goal is really, I think, more of like an awe. I think the ultimate wisdom is like just seeing the awe in the complexity of things and not even having all the answers, but just being like, wow, like, even though I only have a fragment of information, there's so much more that my brain can't even comprehend. And it's just kind of like gazing at the stars and remembering that we are a rock floating in space. And, you know, like we are like orbiting around the sun and literally like we live about 100 years. Like that in and of itself is just like very odd, right? Like, and depending on your, you know, spirituality and background, you can explain it different ways. But when you're having a hard time, just remember we're floating in space and there's billions of stars out there. And just like the little ants, like on the ground, like you pay no attention to them. Like it is probably their life feels really meaningful to them too. And their pain and suffering feels like the world is ending to them too. But then there's just such a bigger like interconnectedness and universe. And we are part of that. You know, people before us and people after us are all part of that. But it's just so like, I don't know, it's just like awe-inspiring and delightful just to think about like all of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's like this mindfulness, and I also heard a little bit of humor, you know, and I think that's something too. Like I know, like with my kids as teens, more often than needing my empathy, like if I go soft on them when they're mad, I've just cut our connection. But if I use a little bit of humor, a little bit, you know what I mean, and again, but we have to be able to have a little bit of that mindful distance in order to see what it is that we need. So where can people go to learn more about your work, to to find your podcast? You know what I mean? So do you want to just share a little bit about where people, and thank you so much for sharing all these pearls, all these pearls with our listeners. So,
You're
tell us
welcome.
how we can find out more about you.
Yeah, my website is delightandparenting.com, and you can, on social media, you can just, type in Delight in Parenting. I have a free Facebook group, and I have an Instagram account. And on my homepage, if you sign up I have a 3 steps to nervous system reset on my homepage. If you sign up for that freebie, you'll get on my email list, and then you'll get my weekly newsletter if you're interested. I publish it once a week. And I have a new podcast every week to date. So I have a podcast as well. Only the first year out, so there's not a ton of recordings out there, but it's growing, and it's just an amazing compilation of experts in mindfulness and child development and parenting, mental health, really all things emotional well-being, and a few physical well-being things sprinkled throughout, but mostly emotional well-being and resiliency. And because in order to raise resilient kids, we have to become resilient parents. And like I said, that in and of itself is a gift to us in the end, because we become actually that which we wanted our children. We have to become that we want to give to our children, which seems like a tall order, but what else are you doing with your time anyway? That's more important,
Awesome. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing, Dajana.
You're welcome.
And I wish you continued wellness. And again, by the way, 1 year of 1 episode a week, 48 episodes is not a small amount of podcasts. So if you look at the Delight in Parenting, you'll see a lot of resources, a lot of great recordings there. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
The world keeps turning, things change. We have new obstacles that are thrown in our way. You can't hold us down. Together we'll get around. You just have to look inside, and you will find that we are in it together. I know it in my heart. You are not alone. You are not, and we are in it together. I've known it from the start. You are not alone. You are not alone. You might feel lonely and down. You might be thinking things will always be this way. But you got a friend in you. Self-compassion will get you through. You just have to look inside, and you will find that we are in it together. I know it in my heart. You are not alone. You are not, and we are in it together. I've known it from the start. You are not alone. You are not alone. We've got Bunny. You're not alone. Doodles. What can you do? Spots. We can be aware. And Snuggles. I care about you. When life gets hard.